for Discussions of Truth. We are at the We Can Act event and Salt Lake City, Utah. Blackout Warfare is written by my current guest, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. An EMP event causing a nationwide blackout lasting 1 year could kill 9 of 10 Americans by starvation, disease, and societal collapse. Dr. Pry, thank you for joining the program, and thanks for coming to the event and doing the work that you do. Peter, what is your doctorate in?
Well, I have 2 PhDs. One is in history with a minor in archaeology, and the other is strategic studies and international relations.
Interesting combination here. What caused you to write this book here, the Blackout book? What has led you to write that?
Well, this is the greatest threat facing Western civilization, and I served as the chief of staff of the Congressional EMP Commission for 17 years. Most people still don't even know what electromagnetic pulse is, and it can be. And we are an electronic civilization. We can't survive without our electronics. We only have a population of 330 million people in this society because of our technological infrastructures, that make it possible to feed those people and to provide water to them. And all of that can go away as a result of an EMP, which can be caused by the sun, not just by men. There's a solar superstorm is one of the things we were most concerned about on the EMP Commission. Every 150 years or so, there's a solar superstorm. Solar storms happen every year. They happen quite frequently, but mostly they only have effects against countries at high northern latitudes like Norway, or Russia, or Canada, and we just see the aurora borealis from them sometimes at and they're not so severe that they cause that much problems, And the countries where they would cause big problems, they've tried to protect their infrastructures quite successfully. But every century or so, you get a solar superstorm like the 1859 Carrington event, which is so powerful it will cause an EMP. And an electromagnetic pulse is just basically a super energetic radio wave. It's got so much energy in it that it will destroy electronics. And
what did it destroy? You're speaking 1850s. What did
1859. Right. That's when the Carrington event happened. And we had just introduced the telegraph system in 1859. The colonial powers, everywhere they built a railroad, and they built railroads in every continent except Antarctica. They were everywhere. In Africa, China, India, we had railroads and telegraph systems. In 1859, the transatlantic cable had just been laid across the Atlantic Ocean to connect North America to Western Europe. It was the cutting-edge electronic technology of its time. And when the Carrington event happened, the solar superstorm crossed the vacuum of space.
What is it, Scotland? Where is Carrington?
Pardon?
Carrington, where is it?
Well, it's a person. He was observing solar spots. He was intrigued by the solar spot phenomenon, and he was observing the disk of the sun and saw this coronal mass ejection come out of the sunspot. And then 11 hours later, there was this solar superstorm that hit the Earth that caused an aurora borealis that was so bright that you could read. It was seen all over the world, and you could read newspapers at night by the light of the aurora borealis in London and in North America. And he made the connection between the sunspots and the coronal mass ejection and the solar superstorm. So that's why we call it the Carrington event. It's the biggest, the most powerful solar superstorm on record so far. Probably not the most powerful that has ever happened. After all, this is only a couple hundred years ago, and the history of the Earth is long, 4.5 billion years. There have almost certainly been much more powerful solar storms than that. But we know that if we had a Carrington event happen today, and it is inevitable, it's going to happen for sure someday. Those telegraph systems. Normally at these events, I have a telegraph key from 1859 that I pass around for people to look at, so you can see what a crude, clunky, primitive piece of electronics that was. But it takes a lot of energy to melt a telegraph key. And that's what happened in 1859. Telegraph keys were melted, telegraph stations caught on fire, telegraph cables burst into flame and caused forest fires. The pulse was so powerful it reached miles deep into the Atlantic Ocean and destroyed the transatlantic cable. those electronics, those primitive electronics of 1859 were literally a billion times less vulnerable to EMP than our modern microelectronics that operate on much lower voltages and have, and can be disrupted by much lower levels of energy. So if we had a Carrington, and civilization didn't end in 1859 because the telegraph system was sort of a novelty. They were a horse and buggy civilization. Most people made their living as farmers. And so civilization didn't come to an end. It cost the billionaires of their day a lot of money, okay? But civilization went on. If something like that happened today, it would be the end of our civilization if we failed to protect our electric grids and other life-sustaining critical infrastructures. The whole world was affected by the Carrington event. And the EMP will be everywhere if there's another Carrington event. And there almost was. In 2012, in July of 2012, we were missed by a Carrington-class coronal mass ejection by 3 days, across the path of the Earth by 3 days. And NASA at that point, warned that if this thing had hit us, that would have been it for global electronic civilization. It would have basically been an end-of-the-world scenario. And they estimated that the likelihood of recurrence of another Carrington event is 12% per decade, which is a very high risk. That means that that within our lifetimes, no later that of our grandchildren, we will experience another Carrington event. And yet we are not ready for it. We haven't hardened our electric grids or any of the other critical infrastructures. Then the other part of the EMP, the subject matter of my book, man can make an EMP with a nuclear weapon. You could detonate a single nuclear weapon at high altitude over North America, say 300 kilometers over North America, over the center of the country, and it would put an electromagnetic field over all of North America that would be even more injurious than the natural EMP from the sun, because in addition to doing what the sun's EMP does, it has a high-frequency component, so it can couple into really small targets, like the personal computer here would be fried. Airplanes, would fall out of the sky. Automobiles wouldn't work.
Satellites?
Satellites would be destroyed. Immediately there'd be no water, because it requires hundreds of millions of volts to pump water to cities and purify water. We only have enough food to feed 330 million people stored in our regional food warehouses for about 30 days, and it would immediately begin to spoil because the temperature control systems and refrigerators would be destroyed. We on the EMP Commission tried to think about, how could we keep 330 million people alive for a year with no food and no water? And you can't do it. That's why we came up with the estimate that we could lose as much as 90% of our population, and if the electric grid fails for a year.
Starvation, famine,
disease, societal collapse. That's mostly what it does, but there's other things that happen too. Natural gas pipelines, the SCADAs that regulate the valves on natural gas pipelines would probably cause the natural gas pipelines to explode, so you'll have firestorms in cities. The 100 nuclear reactors that we have, their emergency power systems, just like in Japan, at Fukushima, Japan only lasts a week. When the grid is down for a week, the batteries run out, and those 100 nuclear reactors would go Fukushima and spread radioactivity over at least half the country. But the biggest threat to life is just the lack of food and water, and of course the societal chaos. You can see, for example, what happened in the aftermath of New Orleans. It usually takes about 72 hours for social order to start breaking down. When people start missing their first meal, then chaos gets introduced into the system, and societal integration starts disintegrating. Now, we know that just from experience of blackouts that have been caused by hurricanes and other phenomena, that it doesn't take long for chaos to come. But there's no reason for us to be vulnerable. That's the thing. The good news is we can protect against these threats. I should mention the other kind of EMP threat. It almost never gets any attention because all the focus gets on the sun and on the nuclear EMP threat, but there are non-nuclear EMP weapons that are really available to anybody. There's design information for non-nuclear EMP weapons that can be found on the internet. There are devices that generate non-nuclear EMP effects that are available for public sale. They're not intended to be used as weapons. They have legitimate industrial purposes. For example, if you're laying out, there's a thing called the EMP suitcase, for example, which is just like a suitcase, and it can be operated by one person, and it costs $50,000, and it generates a EMP that's 100,000 volts per meter, okay, over a short distance, a couple hundred yards. And its purpose, it has legitimate useful purpose. If you're designing an airport, and you want to know how far do I have to set the radar back from the where the planes land so it doesn't fry the electronics in the airliners, you can use the EMP briefcase to simulate the effects of a radar, to see, well, this is how far back it has to be. And it will save you, a lot of guesswork about how far back it has to be. You can be sure that you're not going to be frying the airliners as they come in when you do it that way. But this thing can also be used as a weapon if you have the money to, and you don't need a license to buy it. Anybody could buy it. It's basically a weapon of mass destruction that can be purchased by anyone. And
who's manufacturing it?
Pardon?
Who manufactures this?
It's in my book Blackout Wars. I don't want to mention that, in public, but it is manufactured by an American manufacturer. But there are German manufacturers. Most industrial countries have devices like this that can be manufactured and are available for general sale to the public. And they don't think about a terrorist or a madman or or a criminal using these. But we have arrived at a place in our society where, if a terrorist or a criminal or a madman wanted to, and understood a little something about the electric grid, he could buy one of these things, put it in the trunk of his car, go to an extra high voltage transformer substation outside of New York or Boston or Salt Lake City, and just sit there and wait until he sees the sparks and the flames coming out of the transformer, and then drive away. And so you would topple the technological pillars of civilization for a whole metropolitan area, all by yourself, one person. That's why and if you had a team of terrorists running around the country, you wouldn't need a nuclear weapon to do an EMP attack. With these non-nuclear EMP devices, you could put the whole country into a protracted blackout for more than a year, just by running around and destroying enough of the EHV transformers. And that's what my book Blackout Warfare is about. It's the first, because Russia and China and North Korea and Iran have a new way of warfare that they consider to be the most revolutionary in history. It's in their military doctrine and in their exercises, where they plan on making an attack on electric grids, attacking the technological Achilles heel. The person who originally conceived this is Russian General Vladimir Slipchenko, who wrote a book called No Contact Wars. And the reason he called it No Contact Wars, that's his word, this description of what I call a blackout war. Okay? The reason he calls it a no contact war is because if you take out the electric grid, you will basically paralyze the enemy's military. And you won't have to have any contact. You won't have to fire a shot. You don't have to take on the Marines or the Navy or the Air Force. You can win a war in 24 hours just by frying the grid. And their plan for doing that uses all of these threats that I've been talking about. Cyber attacks, physical attacks, a handful of saboteurs running around with rocket-propelled grenade launchers and high-powered rifles to shoot up transformers, non-nuclear EMP weapons, and the ultimate cyber weapon, a nuclear EMP attack. Any one of these things could cause a nationwide blackout that would enable you to win World War III, in effect, without firing a shot against our armed forces or having to confront our armed forces. But put together, the synergistic effects make it irresistible. And Blackout Warfare is the first book that's written in the West that takes the Russian, Chinese, the North Korean military doctrine and has experts, because I didn't write the book by myself. There are chapters that are written by our experts on cyber warfare, our expert on sabotage, our expert on non-nuclear EMP weapons, our expert on nuclear EMP. I co-wrote that chapter with one of my colleagues, and how we would plan to put all these things together to attack the American grid. The first step toward being able to defend yourself is know how the enemy is going to attack you. What is his plan? And this book is his plan. And so, and we also provide the solutions to the plan. Because the good news is, as terrible as this threat is, there's really no excuse for us to be vulnerable to these threats. We have known for decades how to protect military systems from EMP, and the Department of Defense has protected command and control and nuclear forces from EMP. They're not well enough protected today because there's this new category of weapon called the super EMP weapon that the Russians and North Koreans and Chinese have that exceeds the military hardening standards. But you can increase the hardening standards and protect civilian grids and protect our military systems. The EMP Commission on which I served had recommended that we increase that standard from 50,000 volts per meter to over 100,000 volts per meter. And maybe I should explain what that means. You know, we measure the threat from an EMP in terms of the amount of electrical energy it generates per meter of length for a target. So this personal computer of yours, for example, has a cord coming out of it that's 1 meter in length. And if a super EMP weapon went off overhead at the speed of light, 100,000 or 200,000 volts of electricity per meter would be injected into your personal computer. If it's 2 meters long, then you multiply that by 2, so it could be 200,000 to 400,000 volts injected at the speed of light into your personal computer. Suppose you're in your automobile. You know, most cars are maybe 5 meters long, so you would multiply by 5, the field strength. So that's 1 million volts getting injected into the automobile you're driving at the speed of light. Obviously, it's going to be very bad news for the electronics of your automobile and cause it to fail.
But catch on fire.
Pardon?
Catch on fire.
It could catch on fire, yes. But you could harden a car to survive even a super EMP attack for probably $100. You know, one of the other things we learned in 50 years of protecting military systems from EMP is that if you design the EMP hardness into the system in the first place, it greatly reduced the costs of protection. It adds only like 1% to 6% to the manufacturing cost. So you could protect a car from EMP if the factories started designing them with the EMP protection built in, the surge arresters, the blocking devices, Faraday cages where necessary. And we as a civilization have proven that we can do this painlessly, maybe without even noticing it, and having a lot of argumentation, which is what we are having now over cyber warfare and natural EMP and nuclear EMP. The politics of EMP are tremendously controversial and argumentative, and the private sector, the utilities don't want to do it, and they spend millions of dollars lobbying against it, and so that's why we haven't been making progress. But when it came to lightning, which is a natural form of EMP, we almost never talk about it. Why is that? Because almost everything is protected against lightning. But to be an electronic civilization, since lightning happens all the time, everything has to be protected against lightning, pretty much. The plug on your personal computer, for example, is most personal computers have a fat plug. Looks a little ungainly. That's because there's a little surge arrestor in that plug. So if there's a lightning strike in the power line, it'll stop the lightning from getting into your personal computer. We've never had an argument about it. Industry just knew, well, these things have got to be protected against lightning. And so the standards were built right into them. And so and this category of EMP is called E2 EMP. And we almost never talk about it, the threat from lightning, because we're protected against it. The other threats, this threat from nuclear weapons, is called E1 EMP. It's this high-frequency threat. And the threat from the sun is basically E3 EMP. And these other kinds of EMP is what we're always talking about. They don't happen often, they're very rare, and so we haven't protected against them. But think of them as super lightning. And so we just have to do for these forms of super lightning what we did for the commonplace lightning, and we'll be okay, And when I was a young man and I first briefed Congress about this back in 1995, I thought, this is great. We'll get the country protected in a year. A bill will be passed. EMP protection will become part of the standard requirements for all electronics, and we'll make the country safe. And now I'm an old man, and I've been fighting this battle all these decades, and we have been winning. We've won all the policy battles.
Is this the commission in the 90s you're serving under? Was it in the 90s?
Yes, it began in Congress in 1995 when I left the CIA and I started working on the House Armed Services Committee. One of the first things they wanted me to do was explain EMP to them.
How long had you been in the CIA, with the CIA?
I was there for 10 years, from 85 to 95, which I think was the most interesting time to have served in the CIA, because it was the most dangerous time when we went from the Soviet Union at its peak when they were seriously thinking about trying to win a nuclear war against us, through their decline, and then the rise of Russia, and the introduction of the new Russian Empire and the new threat coming from Russia, So those were the most interesting times to serve. And then I moved over to House Armed Services Committee to advise them on this. There had been an incident that raised the question of the Congress in 1995, in January. In fact, on the 25th of January 1995, probably the closest we ever came to nuclear war. It was after the fall of the Soviet Union, that involved the launch of a Norwegian meteorological rocket called the Black Brant 12, I think it was called, from Andoya Island. And the Russian General Staff, there had been a clerical error, and the Norwegian ballistic missile launch notification didn't find its way through the Russian bureaucracy into the hands of the General Staff. Due to a clerical error, they thought that this was a sub-launch ballistic missile coming out of an Ohio-class submarine in the Arctic, making an EMP attack on Russia. And so they put their forces on high alert and were urging Yeltsin to push the button to launch a preemptive nuclear strike on the United States. The whole thing only lasted 20 minutes. Thank God.
You knew about it during the 20 minutes?
Yes. We knew about it afterwards. We found out about it afterwards because Yeltsin, the next day, went to some kind of a factory, a microwave factory, where they were doing defense transition at the factory, and he was supposed to give a speech about how, this was going to be good for the Russian economy and all of that, and he just kind of broke down in the middle of the speech and said, yesterday I almost pushed the button, and we came this close to a nuclear war, and it just all came spilling out. And then other members of the Russian General Staff came forward and criticized him for spilling the news, and the designer of the Russian football, the Cheget, the thing that launches the nuclear forces, said, I've been warning you guys that something like this could happen, and we could get into an accidental nuclear war. And so, but yeah, I was in the agency. It was one of the last things I worked on. And then I transitioned to the Congress, and they said, and the Congress was interested, and they said, why would the Russians be so alarmed by the launch of a single ballistic missile? Why did they almost launch a preemptive strike over that? And I said, well, it was because of EMP. And they had not heard of EMP. Only one member of Congress had a scientific background and knew what EMP was. They were afraid that we were doing against them what they were planning to do against us, that you would precede a massed nuclear war, to win a nuclear war, by doing an EMP strike to fry the command and control systems, to fry the bombers and the ICBMs in their silos so you couldn't retaliate. And then you launch the weapons to go to ground to actually blow up the bombers on their airfields, the missiles in their silos, the submarines in their ports, and win a nuclear war. And they thought that's what they were planning to do to us, and they thought we were getting ready to do that against them. And there's more to that story. It's kind of a complex history, as to why they thought that was so critical. But that whole thing happened because of a clerical error. The guy in the Russian Foreign Ministry who was supposed to pass the ballistic missile launch notifications was new on the job, and he didn't know it was supposed to go to the Russian General Staff. And so, the world came within one push of the button from being destroyed in a thermonuclear war. But fortunately, that alcoholic Boris Yeltsin, he couldn't believe that Bill Clinton was going to launch a surprise nuclear attack against Russia, even though his general staff was convinced it was happening, and he wouldn't push the button. They failed to talk him into doing it. And then, when the missile passed apogee and landed in the Arctic Ocean, the crisis was over. They could see, this isn't an incoming EMP attack. Nonetheless, the General Staff didn't back off afterwards, and they said, well, they're just testing us. It wasn't this time, but they're just testing us, and next time it probably will be real. And such is their paranoia. But yes, ever since then, I've been trying to get the country protected, and not just me, but of course that's why the Congressional Commission was stood up to see if, at that time, a lot of people were thinking, well, we only have to worry about Russia when it comes to this. Surely the Chinese and the North Koreans and the Iranians are not sophisticated enough to think of this EMP attack and to execute it. And that's one of the reasons the commission was established, to get our best scientists, our nuclear weapons designers, our best EMP experts,
this
our
is
best
in the 90s.
officers. This is beginning in the year 2001. Yeah. We from 1995 to 2001, we had a series of congressional hearings on EMP. For the first time, we were educating the public because it had been deeply classified, and these were unclassified briefings to educate our policymakers about this EMP threat that most of them have never heard of.
How long had you known about it?
Oh, God, I knew about it when I was a teenager, even before I joined the CIA, because I had planned when I was 13 years old. I'd read Herman Kahn's on thermonuclear war, and I had wanted to join the CIA. My eyesight was so bad that none of the military services would take me. I volunteered to fight in Vietnam, but they wouldn't take me because I was legally blind. I only don't have to wear glasses now because of LASIK, And but at the time I was considered legally blind and not suitable for military service. And so my fallback to that was, if I go into the CIA, I can serve my country that way. And I read everything I could on nuclear weapons and the rest. And one of the things I read was Glasstone's The Effects of Nuclear Weapons, which is a Department of Defense book, and it explains EMP. So I knew about the significance, some of the significance, and I inferred. It didn't come right out and say in Glasstone, for example, that this is a way that they could win a nuclear war. All right, they just described the physics phenomena and how an EMP works and stuff like that. But the idea that our forces were potentially extremely vulnerable and an adversary could win a nuclear war, all of that was deeply classified. The consequences to the civilian electric grid, to water systems, that it could destroy our civilization, all that was deeply classified. And Dr. William Graham, who was my boss on the EMP Commission and is the free world's foremost expert, wisely said, it's time to tell the people. We need to tell the people. The people need to know this. The people in the private sector need to know, because we need to protect our electric grids, our water systems, our food infrastructure, our communications. The Russians and Chinese have protected theirs. We cannot be behind them in doing this. And it's not going to happen if we let the Department of Defense just sit on it. And it took us years. It took us 3 years to let the Department of Defense finally declassify what we've gotten in the unclassified EMP Commission reports. Oh, you asked for a website. Here's a website for people to read, www.firstempcommission.org. www.firstempcommission.org. Dr. Graham made available on this website all the unclassified EMP Commission reports. You can become a cutting-edge EMP expert if you go and read. Some of that material is really not for the average people. It's for scientists and EMP specialists, but much of the material is, the chairman's report, for example, and the executive report. There's a report in there on nuclear EMP attack scenarios and advanced nuclear EMP attack scenarios and combined armed cyber warfare. Complex title, but everybody can understand it. And if you read only one report from the EMP Commission, I would recommend people to read that one. That or the chairman's report, which really lays out the threat. So from 95 to 2001, we were trying to make progress in Congress. And then during the Balkans War, a bipartisan delegation went to Vienna, actually, to meet with our Russian counterparts because it was the first war NATO was engaged in, the Balkans War against Milosevic. When we were bombing the bejesus out of Yugoslavia, the Serbs, for ethnic cleansing. And the Russians were backing up Milosevic and the Serbs and keeping them in business, so the war was dragging on and on. And a congressional delegation went to Vienna to meet with their Russian counterparts to try to convince them to stop supporting Milosevic and the Serbs. That was the point of the meeting. And the first thing that was said at the meeting to this bipartisan congressional delegation from the Russian side was, the Serbs have been historically a long-standing Russian ally, and now you want us to abandon them. And I'll tell you, if we wanted to stop you from bombing the Serbs, we could do it immediately. All we'd have to do is launch one sub-launch ballistic missile and do an EMP attack over your country, and we would shut you down. And that, and what came out of that, the Russians did not agree to stop supporting the Serbs. The war went on. But the most important thing that came out of that Vienna delegation was everybody in Congress came back and said, wow, we've just been threatened with an EMP attack in the year 2001 by the Russian Duma, over Bosnia and Serbia, This is really scary that they did that. We'd better set up a commission to see just how bad this problem is. And so that's where they established the EMP Commission. And we found, as a consequence of the analysis of that commission, that all the bad guys know about EMP and are capable of implementing it, or were planning to implement it. North Korea, Iran in 2010 wrote a military textbook that talks about making an EMP attack on the United States, and all their calculations are correct. And that alone should raise questions in people's minds about how is our intelligence community actually right about the status of Iran's nuclear weapons program. If they're talking about making nuclear EMP attacks in 2010, how does it follow that they don't have the bomb and that they're ignorant of nuclear science, to be able to get the bomb? I've personally been convinced since then, that Iran probably has had the bomb clandestinely, the way, North Korea developed it initially clandestinely. And we didn't. We know they got the bomb in 1995. They just didn't bother testing it until 2006. So they actually had a nuclear weapons program that was going on all through the Clinton administration that was telling us they had solved the North Korean nuclear problem because of their agreed framework. I happened to be one of the other things I did on Congress. I served on the North Korea advisory group to Congress, and we knew they were cheating on the agreed framework and developing, atomic weapons. And the Clinton administration was just kicking the can down the road so that the next administration would have to deal with a nuclear North Korea. And unfortunately, that was the Bush administration.
How are the North Koreans getting this clandestine?
Well, the Russians and Chinese are helping them. The North Korea is a client state for both of those countries, and this is something else that I think Washington doesn't get. That in the new Cold War, the other side in the new Cold War is a coalition of Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and international terrorism. They have different ideologies, but they are working together against us. And they want to create a new world order dominated by themselves. And so they have to eliminate us from the world stage, either physically, by war, or, as Sun Tzu said, the greatest victory is to win without war. And they're doing a pretty good job doing that so far, being able to achieve their goals without war.
A physical.
Pardon?
A physical.
Yeah, without a physical,
a
physical war. I mean, that's one of they've learned the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis and of the Cold War. Kennedy won the Cuban Missile Crisis without it becoming a thermonuclear war because we had a 5-to-1 superiority in ICBMs and superiority in strategic bombers. That's why Khrushchev was afraid to go to war and didn't go to war with Kennedy, because we had an advantage in those intercontinental delivery systems, and they would have lost trying to fight us. It wasn't just because Kennedy was courageous and handsome, okay? It was because he had a 5-to-1 superiority in nuclear ICBMs, chiefly that won the Cuban Missile Crisis. Ronald Reagan understood, when we faced a window of vulnerability under Jimmy Carter that Ronald Reagan closed. And he built up our nuclear forces so that the Soviets didn't have a warm-winning advantage over us anymore, so that we at least had parity with the Soviets. And then he introduced the concept of the Strategic Defense Initiative that really scared the bejesus out of them, because they assumed that we were going to go forward full blast with the Strategic Defense Initiative, which would have rendered nuclear missiles obsolete. And we would be much better off today, would be protected from these threats had Reagan's vision been realized and we had proceeded with the promise of SDI. Which was not an impossibility. And in fact, there was a system ready to deploy under the Clinton administration called Brilliant Pebbles. A good friend of mine, Ambassador Cooper, you might want to interview him about it, Brilliant Pebbles. And but Clinton administration, believed that mutual assured destruction was the cornerstone of strategic stability. And in order to deploy the Brilliant Pebbles, you had to break the ABM Treaty, and that the ABM Treaty was also the cornerstone of strategic stability. And so he canceled SDI, and the system never got deployed. And instead, we've got this one-sided nuclear arms race going on with Russia and China. But that's how North Korea has evolved so rapidly. It's just really insane to think that North Korea. Our intelligence community is just so broken. In the spring of 2017, they were predicting that North Korea is still a decade away from having an ICBM that can reach the United States, and there's a decade away. from having a hydrogen bomb, okay? Before the summer was over. They were saying that just a few months before, on July 4th, North Korea demonstrated an ICBM that could hit any target in the United States. And then by the end of the summer, on September 3rd, very close to the anniversary of the outbreak of World War II, by the way, but on September 3rd, 2017, they tested a hydrogen bomb, you know? And how did they do that? Is it because the North Koreans are geniuses? No, it's because the Russians and Chinese. In fact, the EMP Commission was visited by a couple of Russian generals who were their top experts in EMP weapons, and they said they demarched us to give us a friendly warning from Moscow. This was in 2004, and they said, you know, there are Russian scientists and technologists working in North Korea on Russian missile and nuclear programs. And we have accidentally, we didn't do it intentionally, but the secret of the super EMP weapon has been accidentally leaked to North Korea. So when you find out that they've got the super, and you probably will in a few years, because they're going to probably be testing one in a couple of years, don't blame us, you know, it was an accident. And you know, I don't believe that. I don't think any of the EMP commissioners believed that. I think they were putting on us on notice and trying to cover their trail as best they could. But then in 2006, they tested this weapon that had the, you know, very low yield, you know, but a very high, you know, gamma signature, because it's the gamma rays that make the EMP. You know, it has the characteristics of what a super EMP weapon. And whatever it was, the North Koreans were very happy with it, because they started putting it on their missiles. And now they've got 2 satellites orbiting over us that could be armed with these super EMP weapons. It's not just my opinion. The Commission warned about that. We even recommended that they be shot down. I was about to say I don't understand why they don't shoot them down. You know, these pass over us several times a day, and if they are armed with super EMP weapons, they could end our civilization. You know, you know, I think
the technology to identify if they are arms, does that exist?
Well, there's a way of finding out. You know, it's not easy. There's a way of finding out. I can't get into the details of how that would work. But yes. But I wouldn't take a chance, you know. They shouldn't be launching satellites anyway. It's illegal for them to be doing that. But I think the Pentagon is just so scared stiff. I mean, this is an example of how you win without fighting a war.
A stealth war.
Well, you build up such... we explained how Kennedy won the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then Reagan won the Cold War, because he built up our nuclear deterrent strong enough so that the Soviets were afraid to gamble in a nuclear World War III. They weren't sure they could win. They were uncertain enough about it that they didn't cross that threshold. And then their society collapsed of its own weight because of the internal contradictions of communism. And so we won without war. Okay? So since we won without war, how can they win without war? They think they can. And I think they can too. And I think they are winning without war. For example, you know, a couple of years ago, in fact, I think it was last year, because of the North Korean threat, we took our most powerful chess piece on the chessboard of the Pacific, a B-52 bomber wing that was based in Guam. We moved it back to North Dakota, you know, because we didn't want it to be struck. Kim Jong-un was threatening to nuke it, okay? And we quietly, we left it there while he was making these threats, but then quietly it was moved back to North Dakota. Do you think Japan and Taiwan and the Philippines didn't notice that? Of course they noticed that. You know, that was the American policemen, as far as they were concerned, visible in their backyard, providing a deterrent against communist China and North Korea. But suddenly he's gone, and he's gone back to North Dakota. And I don't think it's believable. You know, the Air Force later tried to justify it and say, well, you know, we'll actually be better being able to operate from North Dakota, and this will be more responsive being able to do it this way. I don't think so. I think that they interpret that as a retreat, you know, from the Pacific, of one of the most
weakness.
Yeah, a weakness. And so they've got to start rethinking, how credible is America? Are they going to come to our defense? You know, the question about Taiwan. We have had 18 war games over the defense of Taiwan, and we've lost every one of them. And that's been in the newspapers. So that the governments of Taiwan, Japan, just recently, this summer, the Japanese did what they're supposed to do as good allies. And when the United States said, that we'll defend Taiwan against the Chinese, the government of Japan came out and said, well, we'll support our American allies. The defense of Taiwan is crucial to global security. And we are an ally of the United States, and we're gonna stand with the United States to defend Taiwan if that happens. And then China almost immediately said, if one Japanese soldier or one Japanese ship comes to the defense of Taiwan, we will nuke Japan continuously. We will suspend our no first use pledge, which was always a fiction anyway. We're going to make an exception for you in the no first use pledge, and we will make a nuclear first strike against you and keep nuking you, and our friends in Russia will join us and nuke you, and North Korea will join us and nuke you until you surrender the way you did in World War II. Then we're going to divide your country into 4 parts, and we're going to occupy you. We and the Russians are going to occupy you, and we're going to draw up new constitutions for the 4 new countries that we're going to invent out of the Japanese home islands. That's what we're going to do to you if you send one soldier to the defense of Taiwan. And the Biden administration said nothing. We didn't say, no, you're not going to do that. Our nuclear deterrent...
This happened a few months ago.
This happened this summer. Yeah, just this past summer. Biden. I wrote an article about this. Biden administration said nothing.
Where's it published?
Pardon?
Where's it published, Peter?
That was Newsmax or The Hill, one of those, maybe the Washington Times. But the Biden administration said nothing. What does that do for our credibility? So they can threaten to destroy Japan, to occupy Japan, and then Australia just recently agreed to cut a deal with us. They're going to take nuclear-powered submarines.
Yeah.
They're not nuclear armed.
Yeah, shunning the French, right?
Yeah, that's right. They're just nuclear-powered submarines that fire conventional torpedoes. They're not nuclear armed. And China threatened a nuclear first strike against Australia for doing that. Okay? And now we've got this space super weapon.
Bulldog's getting a large bark.
Yeah, that was just tested in August, and that surprised the U.S. intelligence community. What did the Biden administration say about that? They did not say, oh, you're not going to nuke Australia. Australia is our ally. Our nuclear deterrent protects that. So stop making threats against our friends like this. When they make threats like that, and we say nothing, that destroys our credibility. And this is how you win World War III without war. Because eventually these guys are going to say, is the United States an unreliable partner? We can see that the balance of power is shifting so dramatically that the United States can't even win a war over Taiwan. They lose in their own war games 18 times, China is they've got these 400 new ICBM silos. In a few years, they'll deploy their DF-41 ICBM, that has 10 warheads. That's 4,000 warheads deployed in a few years. The United States only has 1,400 strategic nuclear warheads. So they will have a 10-to-1 advantage over. We have 400 ICBM warheads. Kennedy had a 5-to-1 superiority in ICBMs in the Cuban Missile Crisis. They would have a 10-to-1 superiority in ICBM warheads over us, just China alone, just using the DF-41 ICBM alone in a crisis over Taiwan. And that would give them about a 3-to-1 advantage in all nuclear weapons if you count all our ICBMs, all our bombers, all our ballistic missile submarines. A 3-to-1 advantage on China's side. They can count, our adversaries can count, and they see, well, this doesn't look good for the United States. So if you can count, and then you see these acts of weakness, actually retreating, pulling our guys out of Guam, they have got to be saying to themselves, at some point they may say, we've got to reach an accommodation, with China and Russia, North Korea. It'll be cheaper and safer for us, instead of trusting that the United States will come to our side and fighting a World War III, which we will probably lose. Doesn't it make more sense to reach an accommodation with them, and say, look, we're going to be neutral. We're not going to be considered allies of the United States. And being a neutral, they may say that, but in effect, that'll be the first step toward their Finlandization, where they become satellites dominated by the totalitarian powers. And that's their plan. That's a plan, and it's working, and they're on the way to winning without war. If that happened, it would transform global order overnight. The post-1945 global order that has been led by the United States and has been good for the world. It has, been leading the world in the direction of free economic and free political institutions will come to an end. And it'll be led instead by a new world order dominated by totalitarian states like China that say their system is superior to ours, to the American system. And they point to things like their economy and their military strength. And unfortunately, the current administration is not a good champion for freedom.
Peter, what you talking about? You mentioned in the CIA, the intelligence community. I don't recall the word you used, but it sounds like it's not in a healthy state.
No, it's been deteriorating over time. People have. I don't like to bust bubbles and stuff, I mean, there are some good people in the intelligence community, just like there are some, and there are good people in the Department of Defense. But look at the intelligence community and the Department of Defense; they are products of our civilization. These people are drawn from our universities. The people, the so-called best and brightest that come out of our universities are exposed to things like critical race theory and the new left version of American history, that condemns the United States as an evil imperialist type power, and they tend to have a different worldview. They have the worldview that Harvard and Yale has, the political science departments and international relations departments of those universities. They don't have the worldview of a fireman or a police officer who is a patriotic American and who understands the reality that this is the best, freest, civilization that's ever existed, and most benign civilization that's ever existed in human history, and is worth defending and fighting for. And instead we have people in charge, increasingly, of our national security apparatus that don't believe in our system and are actually hostile to our country.
What are they believing in? Where is this coming from?
Coming from our universities. It's coming from our culture. The entertainment culture has been totally captured, by the left. Most media, most movies, and things like that come out. Now there are dissidents. I was a dissident. My views were not representative of the typical worldview, that you would find at CIA. I was a conservative hawk in the CIA.
Ray McGovern?
Pardon?
I'm not familiar with that name, Ray McGovern.
No, I don't know him. But
John Kiriakou?
No, I don't know him either.
All right, tell me when you're ready, Nissa.
Yeah, but people like that are being forced out of the system,
It's like a talk show.
and increasingly, the kind of people they bring in have a shared worldview, which is the new left, politically correct worldview.
Nice to meet you.
That dominates Washington from the Biden administration.
Is it Marxist? Is it?
Yeah, it's fundamentally a Marxist worldview. It's not straight Marxism-Leninism. It's like you would get from the Soviet Union. It's the brand of Marxism that comes out of the American university, and it believes in identity politics. It's Marxism that's intersectional with identity politics, so that you've got all these oppressed classes, oppressed sexes, oppressed females, oppressed minorities, people oppressed because of gender identity, and the paradise would be a new system, that destroys the foundations of the Judeo-Christian civilization that has created this evil, prejudiced, structurally racist and biased system in all these ways, to replace it with a new system where individualism is subordinated to the collective, where people are in effect a new American man, the way the Soviets tried to make a new Soviet man. A new American man would be, they wouldn't even use the word man, a new American person, that has all of these politically correct ideals that are that come from the university. We have, there are heroic individuals that fight back. There was somebody in one of our nuclear weapon labs, a guy who went onto the blog to protest the fact that critical race theory was being forced upon all of our nuclear employees at our nuclear weapon laboratories. They were forced to take these critical race theory classes that were very anti-American, and that were antithetical to the fundamental values of what our civilization is. And President Trump understood that and tried to ban the teaching of critical race theory in any federal. But the Biden administration has reversed that executive order, and critical race theory is being imposed upon people. Mandatory COVID vaccination, violation of fundamental natural and constitutional civil right. Whatever happened to our body ourselves, right? Your personal autonomy over your body is your most fundamental natural right, which is being taken away. And over 100 scientists in Los Alamos National Laboratory are being fired. 100 of our nuclear scientists because they are refusing to take the COVID vaccine. And they've got a lawsuit going on. That was by an article not by me, but by somebody else in the Hill recently, just this past week. So, it's frightening how quickly we are sliding into a totalitarian model. And hopefully through interviews like this, if you go back and you read the Federalist Papers, written by Alexander Hamilton and Madison Monroe, they kind of anticipated that this could happen. Topsy-turvy. If you read the Federalist Papers as a conservative today, you'll say, they were wrong about everything. Because what they were saying is that it was okay to go from a confederation of states to a centralized federal government, that this would not become a tyranny or a monarchical system. Washington would not become a new Rome, because there were so many safeguards against it. They conceded that could happen, but they argued to those original founders that there were all these safeguards built into the system that would prevent it from happening. And if you go back and reread the Federalist Papers today, you'll see that every one of those safeguards has been breached, has fallen, and we're down to the last one. The last bulwark against tyranny in the Federalist Papers is the Second Amendment and the people. That the people will not tolerate a new Rome, that the people are jealous of their freedom and will not become subordinates and allow themselves to be dictated to. Hopefully that's still true. In the America of Jefferson's time, it was true, because people were small farmers and shopkeepers. They mistrusted government, very suspicious of it. That government governed best which governed least. And they were proud of self-sufficiency and rugged individualism and being able to take care of themselves. They understood in their gut, as my father's generation understood, that as soon as you start taking a handout from government, as soon as you start trusting government to do anything for you, to that same degree you are less free, and they have control over your life. I think they were the last of that great generation that thought like that. My father's generation, the generation that came out of the Great Depression and won World War II, were the last of the pioneer stock, And we've had a couple of generations since then that have been brainwashed through our university system and our school system and have been taught the Marxist approach to life, this new Marxism, the new left view, of collectivism and this perverse philosophy that came out of the 60s and is now, being imposed upon us. And that's the big question. Are we still really a free people? Are there enough of us left so that we will say no? You know, I don't think that the Second American Revolution has to be violent. I think it can be peaceful.
But it needs one. Are you saying it needs
one? Yes, it needs one. The people have to say no, and the people have to start taking control and doing the things for themselves that the government refuses to do or hasn't been doing. You know, we don't have to be helpless against EMP and cyber warfare. Individual states, I don't know if I mentioned it, but there's one of the reasons I'm here is that there's a bill in front of that's going to go in front of the Utah State Legislature to protect the Utah electric grid from EMP and cyber warfare. This is a very positive, healthy thing. It's the way we were supposed to work. It's the way we would have worked. It's the way the America as envisioned by the founders wanted it to work. That if Washington doesn't do the job, then the states can step in and do the job. And if the states don't step in and do the job, then your community can do the job. And you can do the job for yourself. There's no reason why individuals have to be dependent on government for their security. People should be able to take care of themselves in a protracted blackout or crisis. Should have food and water. My parents had never heard of EMP, but every inch of our 1/3 of an acre was a garden. And my mother was growing all kinds of food. She canned enough food all the time so that we could live for years. You know, she had lived through the Great Depression. She'd seen government fail in war. My father taught us to hunt and fish, not just for recreation, but because he fed his family through the Great Depression hunting woodchucks. They called them Hoover hogs after Herbert Hoover, the president who people wrongly blamed for bringing on the Great Depression. And people can do that as individuals. But they should be doing all of it. They should be politically active, saying no against these tyrannical things that make no sense, that are part of the expanding tyranny of the federal government, and being proactive and doing the things that we need to survive, you know, as a people. I think that the protection, the EMP and cyber protection can be an important step toward restoring states' rights and restoring federalism with a small f, restoring constitutional Republican government the way it was originally conceived. Because when the feds fail to do it and they leave this power vacuum, the states can step into it legitimately. And when you take on national security, that's the single most important job of the federal government in the Constitution. If you're doing that in the states, then every other responsibility of the federal government can logically be done by the states as well. So if we seize the highest ground that's available to us, you know, that opens up a lot of territory for us to take back from Washington, to take it back, you know, so that we get ownership and control over that part of our lives again.
Peter, let me ask. Go ahead.
Let
me ask you this question.
Sure.
How long do you think this infiltration, as we were discussing, it's really a cultural infiltration? How long has this been prevalent in the United States? And what I'm going to insert here is a JFK comment. As a former CIA operative yourself, he said he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces.
Yes, and I don't blame him.
This is back. Talk about that.
Well,
this is decades ago.
Yeah, the CIA had failed him in the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's why he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. The communism, you know, at the time, Washington was engaged, as we are today, in a great ideological struggle with what was then the Soviet Union. Is the future of the world to be freedom or communist totalitarianism? And so every symbolic victory or defeat really mattered in terms of how the rest of the world was going to line up. You know, whole third world and Western Europe that was still kind of trying to recover from World War II, you know, was looking for where's the future? Where do we go? You know, all the European countries had communist parties in them, you know, so it was possible for communist governments to come to power. So the fall of Cuba was an enormous embarrassment to the United States. Here was a country that was in our own backyard. We were the leader of the free world. We were heavily invested in Cuba. It should have been a showplace for the triumph of free enterprise and
it was at one
free
point.
Political systems. And it was, but there was also a lot of corruption there as well. But it fell to communism, so that was an enormous coup for the Soviet Union. And so the CIA told Kennedy when he came into office, and this crisis was new, I mean, it was one of the first things he faced when he came in as president, said, don't worry, you know, we've got the Bay of Pigs operation all lined up. You know, we can we'll get the Cubans to turn
Some people
Cuba
say,
back
well,
into being a free system, so we don't have to embarrass ourselves by going in there with the Marines and looking like imperialists. The Cubans themselves will do it. We've trained a Cuban army to do it. And of course, we know what happened there. They didn't get support from the Air Force because the way it was planned was the U.S. military wasn't supposed to come into their aid. We didn't want to look imperialist. That was at least the CIA's planning. And when that went south and turned into such a disaster, Kennedy was legitimately, furious with them and said, I'm seriously thinking of destroying the CIA. And who knows, maybe as a country we would have been better off, without it. The FBI, which was given to us, a lot of people didn't want to support the FBI because they were afraid of building a tyranny in Washington, But ideological penetration of the left into the most prestigious American
God and man at Yale.
Yeah, God and man at Yale. Which is what Buckley's message is that our
Nathan Hale?
Pardon?
You're familiar with Nathan Hale?
Yeah, of course. The great patriot who died in the American Revolution.
The statue of him at Yale.
There's a statue to him out front of CIA headquarters too. Yeah. And and Buckley was warning that here one of our leading should be an intellectual bastion for freedom.
Yeah.
In fact, is being penetrated and captured by the left and by the concepts of big government. So it's been happening for a long time, I saw the effects when I was a graduate student in the 1980s, when there were still conservative professors around. But if you wanted to talk about conservative politics, you had to do it behind closed doors. They were afraid that their colleagues on the left would hear them, and then they would.
This is in the 80s.
Yeah, this was the 80s. And now I can just imagine what the universities are like. I don't think there are any, or there are very few conservative professors. There's clearly in a minority. And there all kinds of diversity is welcomed in the American universities, except intellectual diversity, which is the most important kind, the only kind that really matters. It should be it should be like a free marketplace of ideas, for people to choose from, and the university shouldn't apologize for supporting freedom and supporting the civilization that makes them possible and that supports them. They should be champions of our system, and you can do that without without becoming a tyranny. And we did do that for a long time. But that's the risk you run when you're a free system, and you are willing to tolerate tyrants, totalitarian views within your system. Professors who are avowed Marxists, professors who are avowed racists, they start off being tolerated, but because they are totalitarians, they organize, and eventually, they are very good at taking over the whole system eventually. And that's what's happened in a couple of generations. Almost all the institutions run from the federal level in American life have been captured by the left.
Dr. Pry, let me ask you this question. I'll paint a small picture on a global stage. The Chinese practice communism, and from an outsider's, this is from my perspective. The Russians are practicing communism. These are, from my view, you can correct me if I'm wrong. This has basically been fed to them through the past 100 years. Communism is an adapted form of government that has been installed or influenced through what we've already talked about, Germany, Karl Marx, and these people. There's a central banking system that the Chinese adopted in 1945 after World War II. The Bolshevik Revolution led to what became the Soviet Union. This is also a central banking system. The central banking system roots to Switzerland. Is there a power? You've talked about D.C. becoming this kind of tyrannical government. You mentioned the word Rome a couple times. Is there a power globally that's existed for centuries that still exist today that might be influencing this ideological, cultural breakdown of the fabric of America?
I'd like to think so. That would be the optimistic view of the world. Because if you can explain it as some sort of a global conspiracy, and I know there are people that have theories like this, and that this is all due to some globalist conspiracy, such a thing is relatively easily counteracted, because you know who those people are and know who their institutions are, and if you get a good president in, then you cut those people out of your lives. I fear the problem is more serious. It's not an accident that throughout most of human history, men have lived mostly under tyranny, and there have been relatively few free systems. Freedom is hard work. It's hard to do. In the Federalist Papers, one of the other bulwarks against tyranny was virtue, a virtuous population. And what they meant by that is that people were well schooled in Judeo-Christian values, so that you had a sound ethical basis. You were honest. You were not so vulnerable to corruption. You believed, in fair play and honesty, and you were educated. That's why they valued public education so much. You were educated in how your system worked, and you were educated in politics. People used to go to speeches that would last hours back in those days for entertainment, and because it was and it was also their duty as citizens. And when the men would leave the ladies for their cigars and whiskey, they would talk politics. I think the average American in the 19th century was far more virtuous, both in terms of his moral fiber and in terms of his awareness of the political issues of the day, than the average American is today, who's largely apathetic about these things, and probably doesn't even know what the fundamentals of Judeo-Christian civilization are anymore. Has forgotten. He couldn't recite the Ten Commandments if his life depended on it. That's where the problem comes from. It's hard work to be free, and that the natural human condition, the devil has an advantage over us, and it's easier to be lazy, mentally lazy, morally lazy. Water is always going to want to flow downhill, not go uphill, and so it's hard work, to maintain that system. America has been remarkable in history for being one of the longest-lived free systems. 200 years has been a good run for us. We haven't beaten Rome. The Roman Republic lasted 400 years before it transitioned into an imperial system. But we did better than Athens, the golden age of Athens, that provides a lot of our political philosophy. The Athens of Aristotle and Socrates and the great thinkers lasted only a century, and they were done in by faction, which George Washington, that's one of our other great vulnerabilities. The tendency of people to not live their political lives as individuals, the way they live their personal lives as individuals, but instead to want to organize into political parties, and then, because it gives you more power, but that results in a less sophisticated understanding of the problems of the day. It results in what today we call bumper sticker politics, and faction is what did Athens in, and it also results in a polarization, because the factions hate each other with such intensity that they will actually hate each other more than the enemy outside the gates, and we saw this in the last days of Republican Rome, where the Senate, the half of the Senate led by Scipio the Younger, who hated Julius Caesar, would rather have seen Caesar and the Roman legions in Gaul destroyed by the Gauls than for him to come back to Rome, to lead a rival faction to the group that advertised themselves anyway as the defenders of the Roman Republic. To this day it's controversial about, who was the real champion of the Roman people in the Roman Republic? Was it Julius Caesar or was it Cato? I said Scipio. I should have said Cato the Younger. But Scipio the Younger was on his side, and it was his military lieutenant. So I'm not entirely wrong on that score. So I think that's the problem. It's more insidious. It's sort of built into free systems historically, the seeds of its own destruction. Because it's so hard for people to have the discipline to be free, to do the hard work that's necessary to be free. But I'm hopeful that we can come back. I'm hopeful that we can have a peaceful second American Revolution. For one thing, we don't even need a majority of the population. The American Revolution, the original American Revolution, was won by a third of the country. A third of the country were revolutionaries, a third of the country were Tories, and a third of the country didn't care. They were apathetic. So I believe that the current revolution, the left-wing revolution that's being imposed on us, is being imposed by a minority. I think that the left that really believes in all this nonsense is much smaller than the mainstream Americans that live, even in the city, in big states and cities, people who believe in America, people who believe in law and order, people who believe in the original Constitution. I think we vastly outnumber these people, but we haven't been doing our jobs. We've been misled by the Republican Party. It hasn't been doing this job. We've got to do our jobs as individuals more and better. And we just can't follow, a Republican Party that hasn't been doing this job, to realize our freedom. And the first step in doing that is to say no. No, we're not going to give up our guns. No, we're not going to let you brainwash our kids into critical race theory. No, we're not going to leave our communities vulnerable to cyber warfare, EMP attacks. We're going to protect ourselves from these things, even if you don't. So to say no, and to fill the vacuum by doing things assertively as well. We will educate our kids at home if we have to into what our real values are, so they can be good Americans. We are going to arm ourselves because we don't trust you guys in the federal government. I'm going to buy even more guns and more ammunition, and I'm going to take courses so that if I have to become a militia, I will, okay? But I don't think it'll be necessary for us to become a militia and to go that far. I just think there's the threat of it will be enough. Because I think that the modern tyrants, one of the things that impresses me most about the left is just how stupid they are. When you look at Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden and their handlers, the people behind their thrones, these are not the evil geniuses that created communism in the Soviet Union. They're not the Lenins and Trotskys and Stalins. They're not Hitler and Mussolini. These guys are very low on the IQ quotient, compared to the evil geniuses that made these other evil empires. And when you look at the Soviet Union, the history of the Soviet Union gives me great hope, because here you had the greatest tyranny in history. Its master class were the most sophisticated tyranny that ever existed in human history. They had perfected tyranny to a science, so that they had hospitals, so that political dissidents could be put into psychiatric hospitals. They had the KGB, not just as a foreign intelligence service, but as a domestic intelligence service. Millions of KGB officers. I think 1/3 of East Germany was working for the Stasi, spying on their neighbors. This was the greatest, most scientifically developed tyranny in history. And you'd think that such an empire, such a powerful pyramid of tyranny would not go away in centuries. But it took only, when people lost faith in communism, it took only a couple of years. And with relatively little bloodshed, these master tyrants were toppled from their roosts, and these countries became free. They, if they did it, we can do it too. But we need to get organized, which is what happened before the American Revolution. We need to have our modern versions of the committees of correspondence. And maybe your show is one example of that. People talking to people, reaching out to people, using talk radio to get educated on these subjects, to start a conversation among, how do all of those people that voted for Trump, who had their votes canceled in a coup d'etat, because I think it's obvious that it was a coup d'etat, and that we are not we are not governed by a legitimate government. I don't think it is legitimate. So what do? How do we counter these guys? And I've kind of laid out a blueprint here about what people can do. Now people have to start getting organized the way the founders did before the first American Revolution. I think that as soon as people start saying no, the Pelosi's and the Schumers and the Joe Bidens are going to be so terrified that they're going to start backing off, and they're going to surrender because they are a tiny minority, and I don't think that they are. I don't think that they're so stupid. We haven't gotten to the point where they're going to be able to call out the Marines, to have the average Marine shoot their fathers and their grandfathers who are protesting. That's not going to happen. If they're that dumb and they go that far, they're done, because the Marines are not going to shoot their fathers and their grandfathers who are protesting and standing up for their rights. They will end up turning their own military. If they're the ones that try to do that and try to use the military to crush us, I think that they're going to get a very unpleasant surprise. And I suspect they know that. That's why they're trying now to have litmus tests within the military. The COVID test is one of them. Are you willing? Are you such a sheeple that you're willing to give up that most fundamental natural right and let me stick something into your body, that hasn't been approved by the FDA? Are you willing to do that? That mindless obedience, that's what's necessary in a military that would kill 6 million Jews or 10 million kulaks, I don't think the American military is anywhere near there. I think we've done a good enough job, and the soldiers who are in our ranks, are basically from constitutional America, the America that believes in the real America, the constitutional America. So they're being for an unpleasant surprise, and I think they're so scared that's why they mobilized 2 army divisions to occupy Washington, because they're so afraid that when they did the coup d'etat, that America would rise up and throw them out right then, and that they were going to need 2 army divisions, to put it off. And they weren't sure that even those army divisions would do it. I think they were pleasantly surprised that Americans, are more even-tempered than that, and are more hopeful than that well, maybe the system will work its way out. But as things go forward, as Americans who are very sober and tolerant and reasonable, the average American is, as they wait, they see the system failing. The Supreme Court didn't come forward. The Department of Justice has been corrupted, so the Civil Rights Division, is basically a totalitarian system. That, the Department of Homeland Security wants to define Trump voters as domestic violent extremists or potential people like that. As they are disappointed, they're going to reach the point, I think, and say, well, it is on our hands now. The system isn't going to work. I think it'll be critical to see, I hear people, including at this conference, talking optimistically about winning the next elections. We'll throw them out in the next elections and recapture the Senate and the House. I hope they're right. I don't think it's true. I fear that, I've seen nothing happen that will ensure that the Democrats will allow the return of free and fair elections. They've learned how to cheat on these elections, and I think they're going to continue to cheat. And I think that might be the final litmus test. If they retain control of the House and the Senate in the next elections, then I think mainstream America is going to say, oh, the system really is totally broken. And it wasn't just Trump that these guys hated. They actually hate the idea of freedom. And
they hate America.
Yeah, a free choice. And this really is a totalitarian system now. And now it's on us. We have to take our country back. So that's what I'm hoping will happen.
Peter, you talk about organization, and I want you to please mention that website again for listeners. Mention your book, where they can get a hold of you. But some final words, some final thoughts that you want listeners to walk away with. What a brilliant discussion, some wonderful time spent with you here this afternoon. What do you want listeners to walk away with? And you can allude to that organizational effect and how to organize, whatever. What do you want listeners to walk away with here?
Okay. Well, my book is Blackout Warfare. You can look it up under my name, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. I've written a whole bunch of books. Blackout Warfare, The Power and the Light is one of the best. The website for the EMP Commission reports is www.firstempcommission.org. www.firstempcommission.org. Those issues deal with this existential threat from cyber warfare and electromagnetic pulse that is the greatest threat that our Western civilization faces, and is really job number one for people like me to try to solve and to try to mobilize the people to solve. Because if we're all dead, then freedom doesn't matter. In order for freedom to matter, you have to be alive. So we need to keep the system alive through an EMP from the sun, or through an EMP attack from our adversaries. On what we've been talking about, the Second American Revolution, which is sort of off track from what I normally talk about, but these are my views, and here I'm speaking for myself and not for the EMP Commission or the EMP Task Force when I talk about these matters about taking America back. I think you've got to remember, what I'd like people to take away is every one of you is unique. Every one of you was made by God. And even if you don't believe in God, you have natural rights that are given to you by nature, okay? And that you are a sovereign individual. You're not part, and that's the most important part of you. You as a person, You must protect your rights and stand up for yourself against this larger collective that tries to convince you that you're not as important as the crowd, as the group, as the collective. The individual is what our whole system is based on. Freedom is based on that whole concept. So that's the first thing to learn. The next thing is to get educated, because only the virtuous people can truly be free. To be educated, what are your values? Do you have a religion? Do you have some kind of a moral system? Think about what that is. Whatever your system is, it's probably rooted in Judeo-Christian values. And that's a good thing. And we need to become more virtuous, all of us, in those values in order to be free. Because the totalitarians and tyrants are trying to penetrate our moral system with values that turn us into sheeple and get us hooked on things that don't matter, on sex and drugs and rock and roll and the hedonistic lifestyle, and that is a cancer that eats away at the structural members of virtue and ultimately of a free society. It's what happened to the Roman Empire in the end, eaten away by that kind of corruption. While being a free individual, we do need to get organized. We need to reach out to each other. And you can start with your own family. And then maybe start with neighbors or friends that you have and talk seriously about what's happening. Become like the 19th century Victorians, who, instead of watching the latest piece of sewage that's come out of Hollywood, your entertainment will now be reading the great books, collectively, or talking about what are the issues of the day and what do we do about them, and what can I do in my own immediate, who's running for that school board, okay? Is this person someone we should vote for? Should I run for the school board? And get active and involved that way. And then I guess last is Churchill's admonition. And this is the motto of the EMP Commission. It was on Dr. Graham's wall. It was from Churchill in the midst of World War II when things were at their worst. And he said, never, never, never give up. And that's what we must do. We must never, never, never give up. We must fight for every inch of our freedom and claw back everything that's been taken away from us. Because this power that Washington is using to try to enslave us now, that belongs to us. We need to take it back from them. We need to take the whip out of the master's hand. And if we have to whip him to the ground. and do it to him before he does it to us. So that's what not a very Christian message perhaps to end on, okay? But I think,
it's a very American.
Very American, an American interpretation of the virtues that Christ taught us. Christ would not want man to sacrifice his freedom and his natural rights, and died on the cross to save man from, I think, not only the political tyranny that existed at the time, but the tyranny that had grown in man's own soul, because those virtues that Christianity represented were not present in the earth until they were introduced by them. That's a whole other topic, but one of the things that used to be taught, and it isn't taught anymore, once that Marxism took over the history courses, is how truly revolutionary Christianity was and the story of mankind. We went from a people who celebrated gladiatorial contests, people being eaten by lions, the cruel gods of pagan Rome. Mars, the god of war, who clothed himself in the flayed skin of his enemies. Aphrodite, the goddess of erotic love. Where the Christian virtues, the idea of modesty and charity and compassion, were regarded as slave virtues and weakness. And yet, in a couple of centuries after Christ, these became the mainline virtues and the foundations of a new civilization, Western civilization. Call it a miracle, and we're struggling to preserve that civilization now, against against a tyranny that is, has the potential. The tyrannies that we face in Russia today, China today, North Korea today, Iran today, collectively, are far worse than the Soviet Union, far stronger than the Soviet Union. And now we've got this tyranny at home, that is on at risk of being overtaken by them, defeated by them, or maybe even passively surrendering to them, and reaching accommodation with them. I talked about how Athens fell in the Peloponnesian War, defeated by Sparta. It was routine in those days when a great city fell that you would enslave the population, kill all the men, kill the babies, and enslave what's left of the population. But Sparta didn't do that. Instead, it had Athens tear down its walls, and the Athenians had to become a tyranny. They gave up their democratic culture and became a tyranny, like Sparta. And then Sparta didn't regard them as a threat anymore, because they had, and that's why we are regarded today, and why we are so much at risk. It's because of our freedom. It's our free institutions that our adversaries fear, and that's why they want to destroy us. And I fear that the unwise leadership, we have in Washington, is so unwise that they may eventually say, we're basically collectivists and we're all socialists now, and there is a lot of good to be said about the Chinese model, and so we're going to reach an accommodation with them, and we're going to put down these troglodytes who still believe in this Constitution that was written by a bunch of white slave owners, back in the 1700s. If they did that, and we hoisted the flag of tyranny over ourselves, to save ourselves, that's an outcome I really fear. So this is our chance to saved Judeo-Christian civilization, and on us to do it. And if we fail to do it, we could enter a new dark ages. You know, if there's an EMP attack, literal and figuratively, we could enter a new dark ages. But we could enter a new dark ages where there's no freedom in the world. You know, for many centuries. Such as happened after the fall of the Roman Empire, 476 AD, when they were finally conquered by the barbarians. You know, technologically and culturally, we didn't come back from that for more than 1,000 years. It wasn't until the Renaissance. In fact, a lot of historians think it wasn't until the early 19th century, with the introductions of the railroad, that we finally had a technological transportation system so that you could get from Britain to Rome as quickly as the Roman legions could back in Nero's time. It took us till the early 19th century to do what the Romans were able to do, you know? That's how long it took us to come back from that dark ages. So these are really big issues, and, I thank you for your giving me an opportunity to speak here. I probably said too much. I can't imagine what's going to happen to me when I have to go back to Washington and deal with these people, because I have to deal with these deep state people. Hopefully they won't watch this show.
Well, what do you mean you deal with them? In what context? In what way?
Well, I advise.
You're saying deep state. What are you talking about?
Well, the Department of Homeland Security, for example. I try to work with them to convince them to protect the electric grid and our other critical infrastructures from EMP. You know, I'm sure they're not going to like me comparing them to a tyranny, and part of a big conspiracy against America.
Maybe they're too comfortable, Peter.
Yeah, I think they are. I think all of Washington is. But there are, there's, I still have hope that something might happen to the federal level, that they might do something to save themselves. When the Colonial Pipeline thing happened, for example, I thought even the Biden administration, can't take that line down, but they did. And, and then this whole succession of other attacks that happened by cyber warfare against critical infrastructures, and they still haven't done anything about it. But one has to, like I said, never give up. I'm fighting the fight kind of in Washington, from the federal level, and I cannot never give up either. But my biggest hope is with you guys and with the people, to turn things around. Because we've reached this civilizational crisis that most great civilizations go through. Where you go from a couple of generations of highly competent people, and it gets slowly, the competency goes away, and then you end up with really corrupt, stupid people at the top, who don't know what they're doing, and the system declines and falls.
I'm going to read you this quote as we wind down. I'm going to give you the last word, okay. But I'm going to read you this quote because it has to do with this guy, Ray McGovern.
Yes.
Now, Ray McGovern is CIA 1963 to 1990.
Okay.
He used to hand-deliver briefings to George Sr. in the White House.
So I never knew him.
He says, and this coincides to what you just mentioned, and it's every other person that's listening to me right now and listening to you speak past hour and a half. Ian, we no longer have free media, he said to me on June 7, 2018. The only hope now is people like you who can repair the damage and get people listening to people who know what they're talking about. Dr. Pry, ladies and gentlemen, knows what he's talking about. I'm sure you'd concur with that, Dr. Pry.
Well, I certainly concur with what he said, and I concur with the sentiment that I know what I'm talking about, naturally. I'm a little biased in that respect, though. But I definitely agree. It's that it's in the hands of the people now, to save what's left of the republic.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, thank you very much, Dr. Pry. I appreciate double PhD there. I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you so much. I'd better get downstairs because I think I'm going to be on deck pretty soon. Anyway.